and welcome to the Real World Rules Supervision podcast. My name is Sue Bay, and I am one of the co-hosts of this podcast. We would like to thank APEC for funding this podcast and hope it will be helpful in amplifying the conversation around intercultural supervision for clinical psychology and other mental health professionals. Today, our guest on the podcast is Dr. Jenine Chiles. Dr. Chiles received her doctorate in clinical psychology. She worked for the Chicago Department of Public Health for 10 years. First in community mental health, then in HIV/AIDS primary care. During that time, she supervised MA and PsyD therapy practicum students and interns. In 2009, she went to work for the Illinois School of Professional Psychology at Argosy University. She started out as an assistant professor and over time was promoted to associate professor. She was a training director for the Lake Michigan Internship Consortium and supervised many interns and worked with many different training sites. She opened the Argosy University Psychological Services Center and was a director until Argosy University closed in 2019. In 2019, she transitioned to the Chicago School of Professional Psychology as program faculty for the PsyD department. For 1 year, she was the training director for the APA accredited the Chicago School Community Internship Consortium. Dr. Chiles has been in private practice for over 10 years in Chicago and more recently in Sycamore, Illinois. Dr. Chiles, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's exciting to be here.
Yes, we're very excited to have you. If you're ready, we'll just start with our first question, which is, what has it been like for you to be a psychologist in various roles, such as clinician, teacher, supervisor? You have assumed many roles before in the context of racism, equity, and social responsibility over the years. What has changed since you first began your career?
I think a lot has changed. I started grad school in the early 90s. I think there's some similarities of what's happening in Chicago now as there were back then. A lot has changed over that time. I think throughout my career, I mean, you talked about the places that I work, but starting in public health, I did a lot of my training in community hospitals and then community mental health, and began working in community mental health. So I really started working with low-income folks, right? Folks that didn't have insurance, people that were certainly living a different lifestyle than I was, right? It was very much an eye-opener for me. I feel very privileged to have had the training experience that I did. Especially a lot of clinics that I worked in, I would be one of very few white people. Mm-hmm. So I had an experience of being an other, but being able to be in a space and working with clients and then with students, and especially like students of color, where the clients were predominantly people of color and most of the staff were people of color, right? Which is very different than seeing a client in a white space.
Yes.
It was a profound learning opportunity for me. Someone who I grew up in suburban Detroit, right? My family moved to Detroit right after the riots there and white flight happened. So a very white suburb next to a very Black city. So a lot of my impressions about race in America were based on growing up in that kind of environment. So coming to work in a predominantly, I worked in different clinics through the city, but a lot of them predominantly Black clinics, and getting to be with people in their environment, not my own. I feel like I got to witness just a much more natural setting and had a better focus on like what was happening in the community, how things were perceived by people that spent the majority of their time in a Black space. I do feel profoundly lucky that I had great colleagues who would kind of like help me into the fold, right? When it came to working with clients who may be, reluctant about like, why do I, one, talking to a psychologist, right? Of the, like, I'm not crazy, to a white psychologist on top of that, but having people that, that knew me, that could make that introduction, that warm handoff, right? Where a little bit of trust to start with from the client, and then being able to work on that relationship. And then being able to work with students in that space, right? And help them kind of acclimate to that and realize how important it was to recognize like where they had come from and all of their influences, right? That got them to that space, and then the reactions that they were being in a space that felt very different than where they had come from. Even I would say for many students of color that I've worked with, because they've been in a very different social class than a lot of the clients that we work with. And sometimes that's a surprise for people. Where they think there's going to be a connection, there's not necessarily. There may be a different kind of barrier. But I can say over this time, there's so much more awareness now because of social media and video, right? That's just been an absolute game changer. I give like an example I go back to in my mind when President Obama was first running, and some video came out of the pastor of his church, and it was perceived by white America, I think, as being very inflammatory. I can't remember the details about what the pastor was talking about, but something about the Black experience, and very focused on what the Black people in Chicago were going through. Hearing about this, I'm like, this makes perfect sense to me. But watching the reaction of a lot of white people, it was that like how much white people just really don't know what's going on in Black America, right? In Black Chicago, I should say, right? Being in this environment in Chicago, and just the cluelessness, right, of what was happening, and how people just assume everybody else is living like them, right? And kind of being shocked by that. Today, obviously very different, because now all that disbelief is met with videos, right? We see things happening to people in all kinds of contexts versus, whether it's, an interaction in a store versus an interaction with police officers that, turns deadly, just this wide variety of experiences that people can see, right? So I think a lot of students are coming in now with more awareness about social inequity, for sure, certainly than they did, I think, when I started grad school. So a lot of change over the years.
Yeah.
I think our student bodies are changing too, right? Where more people are getting interested in our field. There's been a gender shift, for sure. I think when I started school, clinical psychology was dominated by white men, right? That switched to white women. We still have a long ways to go in diversifying our field, for sure. But there's been some pretty constant change throughout.
Yeah, I agree. Just the other day, I watched an interview with Dr. Kendi, and they had 5 white people read his material and reflect on his book. And just like you said, because of the existence of social media and videos, I think it was much easier for people who lived in suburban America, who had maybe never interacted with a lot of people of color, were able to really grasp what he was saying in his book. So it is kind of more encouraging and more hopeful.
It is. I think there's, I think there's some downfalls of social media, but on the other hand, I think it gives us all a window into other people's lives, right? That are vastly different from our own.
Exactly. That is one major change. Yeah. Well, have you had the opportunity, I assume you have, to do your own work regarding racism and identity? And how has that changed the way you work with people that you supervise, whether that you're supervising students of color or interns of color, or the majority students? And After, going through so much training as supervisors and psychologists, how do you manage your own reactions during the supervisory process?
Sure. I'd say my grad program had a wonderful diversity program. I feel super privileged to have learned. Dr. Samela Abdullah was my diversity professor. I think
Yeah.
for a lot of people that went to ISBP, she was life-changing. Extremely difficult, extremely difficult, right? And I say in the classroom work that we did a lot of what was very impactful was saying out loud what our biases were. It's one thing to read, right, and take in knowledge. It's another thing to dig down and share something about ourselves that are like our ugliest parts, right? And to say that out loud. I learned so much from her, from that class, from my peers in our ongoing work, right? It was kind of like, like the blinders have been taken off, like begin paying attention. But obviously that's just the start, right? It's like our society is changing all the time. I've certainly noticed over all of this time, just how my beliefs change, right? And things will pop up and I think, oh, right, this is something that's been in my blind spot, right? That I have to be open to, right? It's still hard to acknowledge, right? There's these pieces of like that I'm having a negative thought about somebody that I really don't know anything about. But to see that and be reminded, right, that it's constant. It's not like you ever hit that point where, okay, I'm culturally competent now, right? It's like it's what we teach, cultural humility, right? Like I'm always learning, always growing. Things are always in a state of change. Now I have Gen Z kids, and I'm constantly making the generational comparisons, and because we have a lot of students now who are Gen Z, I just see the vast differences in our generations and the things that kind of they take for granted, right? That I have to really kind of work towards. I think in supervision, and it's been really interesting to see kind of like what younger people bring in and their ideas, what they've been exposed to. There's usually something that people are really excited about, which is great. Sometimes that means like then they are ignoring their blind spots, right? So it's trying to bring them to that awareness. But I think in supervision, what's been really helpful for me is that when I can own my own stuff and say, this is an experience I had where I made these assumptions about somebody and really had to look at that and explore that. And here's how it changed my work with them once I was able to do that, right? Or thinking like, I know these are biases I've grown up with and I have to think about these things as I sit with the client. And if I can share that, I think it creates a little more safety for them to open up and begin to share and to see, like, the most important thing, right, is if we don't have a safe space and we can't be honest about what we're thinking and feeling, right, the work is not going to progress. Their relationships with their clients aren't going to deepen. They're not going to grow. So I have to model that all the time.
Yeah, that's so hard.
It kind of breaks the barrier, right? Because as much as I think like I'm always growing and I don't perceive myself as having a lot of power, I know obviously sitting with a student, right, they see that as the professor, as a supervisor, especially as a supervisor, I think they really feel that power differential. So there's tend to think like, okay, how can I knock that down and show them, I am human too, right? I'm not the perfect clinician. There's always, mistakes and things to explore, and we don't want to hide from that, right? Want to kind of lay that out there, examine it.
Yeah, that sense of vulnerability is so important, especially when we talk about these issues of diversity, I think, because everyone feels quite vulnerable in these conversations, right?
Absolutely, right? And I think when you can show that, right, I'm vulnerable too.
Yeah,
I have my blind spots.
exactly.
It makes me uncomfortable still, right? But
yes, yeah. It's work in progress, like you said. It's a lifelong journey, really. As you know, because you have supervised so many of the students, interns, postdocs, what are some obstacles and barriers that you have encountered, whether they're at an individual level, institutional, cultural, and especially in the context of training our students or supervisees to become more culturally competent?
I think, one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is like institutionally, in the classroom, right? Who's in your classroom?
Mhm.
I often, because I teach diversity, right, it's like a year-long class, and then having seminar. My experience so far, like I may have one Black student, or one South Asian student, or
Mhm.
one student of color. And we can talk about at the beginning of class, it's always like, nobody here represents their group. But I think as the year goes on, it's a difficult place. I imagine, right? Because I'm not in that position, but that it's a difficult place to be in only in a classroom. And as much as we can talk about like this is not good, it's like this keeps happening. So I'm looking at institutionally, what do we need to do to make sure that
Mm.
our field is much more representative of the American population, right? Because when you look around school, it's not,
Right.
right? The majority of Americans are not white women. And it's like, how do we attract more students of color
Mhm.
to train at this level? And just create an environment, right, where that student isn't always feeling like because they don't remotely represent their race,
Yeah.
right? And you can see other students, like you have this conversation, but they may think that. So it's kind of like, what do we need to do as a field to bring more people in? And I think one of the things I struggle with is it's not just how do we get more applicants, right? But going back, how do we get into like high schools and talk to students about this career path, right? And why they might choose that, but all the things that are going to come ahead. I know the Monitor had an article a little while ago about undergrad programs and students of color and the opportunities that they get for mentoring, right,
Mhm.
compared to white students.
Yeah.
And just when that happens, right, sitting on admissions, right, in a graduate program, we're looking for people who've had some clinical experience, who've had some research experience. Oftentimes those things come more easily to white students who have faculty reach out to them and say, come work in my lab, come TA for my class, come, do you know about this internship position? And what their article is saying, for students of color, sometimes they're finding that out much later in their undergrad career, because they're trying to play catch up their senior year, which is obviously a disadvantage then when comparing to graduate programs. And of course, we want the people who are the best and the brightest and have the most experience. So I think it's incumbent on us. How do we go back and help people know that they need to find those experiences earlier on and be reaching out? So institutionally, I think that's a frustration that I have. Not one that I have a lot of power over, but tell people higher up, like, this is what I think, and like, can we figure out ways to explore that?
Yeah. Well,
I started with the, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I started with the institution piece and I got stuck on
Yeah.
that. You asked me again and I can address some of the other pieces.
Yeah. Well, it's so hard because visibility is so important. I think one of the issues is that when students of color look at programs like the Chicago School clinical psych program, you don't see a lot of faculty of color. And so I think that makes it that much harder for them to imagine that they could one day be also be teaching, supervising, and so on. As when we look at administrators, people who really do have a lot of power in the institution, most of them are white. Recently, we've gotten someone who's not in that position. I think visibility is really important.
It's very important. And also too, I think then for students, well, and for the faculty, right? If I'm sure you're aware, if you have only a handful of faculty, that feels to me like a lot more pressure on them to be attending to the students of color, right, as they're trying to work their way through a program and all the extra stressors that they face, right? And also in looking for support. I mean, our faculty are outstanding and doing all kinds of incredible things. And then here's one more thing that you need to do, right? It's to help carry along these students, right? Which isn't, it's not fair, right? It's like, it would be nicer if it was much more, I mean, if the faculty was more diverse, it wouldn't be as heavy load on each person.
Yeah, I agree. It's the institutional barriers that are most challenging, I think, right, for us.
Yeah. That's right. Yes, I feel most frustrated. Even thinking about, like, one thing I think a lot about is the cost of graduate school, right? It's huge. And if you're not in a place where you have family that is going to help pay for that, right? Even contemplating what does that look like on the other side? If you don't come from a family where you see people who have very successful careers, right? And thinking about, like, are you going to have a job that's going to allow you to pay back all of these student loans? You can be much more reluctant to take that risk. Right. Where I think if you grow up and you see, if you have lots of professionals or other highly educated people in your family, you may perceive that risk as less. So part of that is like working to, like, show students, how are you going to be employed? What's out there to help pay back your loans? What's going to make this more manageable and not be just something for people who are very wealthy?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, the obstacle that you talked about that's related to, the institutional obstacle where we don't see a lot of students of color or students of color who start to think about the trajectory of their career early on, like other students. It's a tough obstacle to overcome. But I wonder if you had some thoughts about how we can overcome or manage some of those obstacles, right? Because someone has to think of some ways to change that and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that comes to outreach, right? Like, how do we begin to partner with undergraduate institutions, with different organizations within those institutions, talking to the different student groups of color, right? Or the psychology groups, and being able to help students, find that path. But I think it's incumbent upon us to, like, do that kind of outreach and the partnering. Right. And to get students early on, right? Like, we need to be talking to freshman classes. These are some of the things you will need to do in your future, or to, like, make sure that you're well prepared for grad school. Thinking about where do we want our students to come from, right? How do we get in there and connect with them?
Yeah, starting early, like you said, maybe even in high school.
Yeah.
Not waiting until college, but really when they're just starting to think about college might be a good place to start. I think early is better for sure.
And probably social media, I think. I mean, that's an advantage, right, to being able to get attention and capture a larger audience. But I think about being an undergrad, getting a PsyD. When I was an undergrad, I discovered this because of a paper I did for an English class, and the people that I talked to, because I was at a big research institution, so of course they were very PhD focused. So they really tried to deter me from getting a PsyD, and there weren't. I mean, there's lots of PsyDs now, right? There weren't back then. I feel like if I'd not been given that English assignment, I might not have made it to this place right now, right? Like, I had to kind of do some digging on my own. But I think we need to be out there catching people earlier and thinking about, like, these are the different career paths in clinical psychology, and how to find the one that fits best for you.
Yes, exactly. I like that. Starting early and taking a more proactive approach rather than waiting until we get those students. That may be a little too late, really. Um, so, given that situation or all the other obstacles and barriers that we face, social context is so important. And I was wondering how you've been able to sort of recognize and integrate the various social contexts. And there's a lot of intersectionality these days as well when working with students and supervisees, um, especially when you're working with those students or supervisees who may not be directly impacted, right, by racism or particular biases and so on. If they're not directly impacted by issues of equity and social justice, how do we train them so that they are aware of that, and what difficulties and challenges do we have when we're training, as you said, people um, who are very different from maybe those that they're working with. Um, Basically, how do we teach them to be more culturally competent, right? No matter what your kind of contexts are. I think that's really the
Yeah.
question that
Yeah.
yeah.
I think experiential learning
Hmm.
is really key. Like I said, there's like, we can all read and read and read. It doesn't
Sure.
necessarily change how we're going to be in the room. And when we give like students experiential assignments, right, that
Hmm.
you need to go do something with with some population that they're not familiar with.
Hmm.
We're not choosing it for them. We're not making them, go somewhere that would make them really uncomfortable, but also encouraging that, like, okay, lean into like what
Yeah.
makes you uncomfortable. And can you go do something with that population, have an experience, and then come back and process it.
Hmm.
Um, so you can kind of focus on like, well, how did it feel for you to be, outside your comfort zone?
Hmm.
What was that like? Um, I think those kinds of things are very impactful, right? Much more so than writing a paper on something, right? As they go out and they have that experience, but also the processing afterwards, right? And you can have
Hmm.
someone ask more probing questions, right? And kind of make them dig into that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I think that has a big impact on students.
Hmm.
Um,
What
I
are some
also
examples
think,
that you ask your students to do or supervisees when you're asking them to really immerse themselves into a situation that they wouldn't normally choose to do? What are some examples?
um, I think a good one. I mean, usually we try to give them like a range of
Yeah.
ideas, right? And
Mhm.
say you talk with your professor about this, so we can
Yes.
make sure that it is something that's going to push their boundaries a little bit,
Yeah.
or push them out of their comfort zone a little bit. Um, but I can think of one where I think the student had a really it was very meaningful. But a student who's upper class, grown up in a very wealthy environment, and went and volunteered um, at a soup kitchen at a homeless shelter.
Mhm.
Right? Some of him, people volunteer at soup kitchens a lot, right? But kind of having had a semester or several weeks of lecture and
Mhm.
discussion, but then going into that situation, knowing, right, okay, as I walk in, I'm going to be paying attention to like, how do I feel in this environment? Um, and noticing which interactions were more triggering for her, and what was it about those interactions, right? What was it? I mean, and some of it was even some of the staff there and the way they primed
Mhm.
the the volunteers to be careful, right, in some ways, and expecting that maybe the people that they were going to be serving, right, because they were homeless, maybe more coarse, maybe not so polished, and having
Yeah.
conversation, right, and kind of warn them like not to engage with some people, especially I think some of the female volunteers, right?
Mhm.
That some of the male volunteers were inappropriate in some way. So even, for her processing, what was it like to get that instruction, right? And then what was she thinking as she
Mhm.
was beginning to engage with people? But because of all of that, like just really being able to pay attention to those reactions and the parts that she didn't like, and to come back and kind of present this
Mhm. Mhm.
to the class. And again, that it's reminiscent of the training I had, back in the
Yeah.
90s, but there was something really powerful about saying it out loud. This made me really uncomfortable, right? And so now I know, like, this is an area
Mhm.
I'll always have to be cognizant of when I'm sitting with someone who's of a different class, right? Or
Mhm.
is it, or someone who's lost everything and is homeless.
Mhm.
Um, but also being able to see a huge variety of people that are being served there, right? And so, like, what her stereotype of homelessness might have been, and then who she encountered and how different that was. Um, Again, I think having that physical experience
Yeah.
was just really different than anything we could talk about relating to class. Um, she
Yeah.
experienced it. It definitely left an impression, I'm sure, that has stuck with her.
Yeah. That's why experientials are so important, right? In training, especially training clinicians to be more culturally competent. There's something about that you can't really read about it and really feel it.
Yes, you can't. And you see the students who are really invested too, right? That are choosing places like, they think
Mhm.
like, I really have no exposure to, this group of people. Let me go see what that's like, versus, there's always a student or two that is really trying to play it safe.
Mhm.
And then you have to push them more, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We have to challenge them so that they really be able to have this opportunity, especially since they're not going to get it that many more times, really.
Yeah.
Once they leave the program or once their training is completed.
Yes, because very soon after, right, they're going to be in there. They're going to be with clients, and
Exactly.
and when we're sending them out with clients, we're saying, we're expecting that they're not going to harm people, right? That they're there to help them.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, this brings us to our next question, which is, I think having our supervisees immerse themselves into something that's real, that's experience based, is a really good beginning. And then they gain that new awareness about their discomfort and so on, or sometimes even about their own privileges and so on. And then we have to and this is kind of challenging for me too as a supervisor, in that how do we kind of make that jump of from maybe the immersion experience to actually providing interventions that are culturally responsive, right? That are appropriate for certain groups of people. And I'm wondering whether you could share your experiences or examples that you might have in terms of culturally responsive interventions that you were able to work with your supervisees.
Mhm. I think, let's say, like, one area of diversity I find, like, that students tend to shy away from is like religion and spirituality,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, within our field, there's
Yeah.
um, just vast differences. I do find more students are religious, but don't speak about that, right? If there's something about, like, if they have to hide that, I think there's this kind of common knowledge that more psychologists are not religious. So students don't share that as
Yeah.
much, but the majority of Americans identify with at least as spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
The religiosity is dropping over time, but trying to help them focus, like, to find a way to talk about that, right? Is that can be a huge support for people, and if they're not acknowledging that, right, they're missing out on some great interventions. Um, we think about, like, when people are depressed, right? We want them to be less isolated, to be more active. Like, what are ways to to do that, right? Someone's spiritual community or religious community can be a huge source of support. It could be that thing to get somebody out of bed, to go to a service, right? To go to a Bible study, to connect with their spiritual leader, right? That maybe they've been avoiding. I think students have to learn how to be comfortable talking about that in a way that it doesn't matter what their own religious beliefs are, right? There's some sense of like, if I don't match with the client, then I can't talk about that. Like they could get it confused with like being, like a religious counselor. So I think helping them think about, and when they are religious, right, to think about like, okay, what is it about your religious community that's helpful to you? How might you help your client see that through their eyes, and how they could do that, is making those connections. How do you, maybe it's getting involved with a group who are safe people to reach out with, to kind of re-engage if you've been withdrawn. If you want them to be more active, what are ways to do that where they're probably going to be met with a warm reception? And I think, I think when students can get past that, not having to talk about what their own religious beliefs are, right? That they can see like these can be really powerful interventions. And for so many of their clients, just to be connected to their communities again, right? If they've withdrawn from that for whatever reason, it just can help their mental health profoundly. So it really is kind of guiding them into like, you can talk about these things that are uncomfortable, right? Like somehow we've been taught like you shouldn't talk about religion unless it's somebody from your own religious group, right? But how do you have the language to do that, to be comfortable with whatever your own beliefs are, but that you can focus on what the client's beliefs are, and how do you incorporate that into their treatment? Which if that's important for your client, I think they're going to be much more successful.
I agree, especially religion or religious beliefs can lead to community building, obviously, and it's a huge asset and could be a huge strength for your clients. I agree with you. I think as psychologists, we often don't necessarily think about religion unless it played a very specific role or very obvious role in the therapeutic process.
Yes, I find students even like in intakes, right? That's something they just kind of blow by that. Maybe somebody wrote something down, but they don't ever ask about it. And it's like, ask. This is can be a huge source of support, could also be, something that they really need to be working on, or could be, an intersectional issue that you don't want to ignore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Also, I wonder, because our profession has so much these days an emphasis of evidence-based practice, like psychologists, science. I wonder if that plays a role in our students' kind of comfort level in discussing spirituality or sense of, religiosity and so on. But you're right that it could really enhance or even give you a lot of information about their cultural beliefs and values and so on.
Yeah, I think part of it too is that, in our educational system, we don't really teach people, and unless you go, in college, you can seek out classes on religion, right? If you went to a religious school, you may have grown up with and be well versed in the religion of that school. But otherwise, as a society, we often don't know very much about religions outside of our own. And I think people then have more of a reluctance to talk about it because they're not well educated, right? And they really have to put in extra work to find out just kind of the foundations of their religion. What are they working with there?
Yeah, it's really about teaching our supervisees how to ask all these questions that might potentially be really important, right? I read the other day that there was a research study done on, clients and their perspective of their therapists. And a lot of the clients said that what their therapists don't ask is actually very telling. They notice what they
Oh, yeah.
ask, yeah, but they also
Yeah.
notice what their clinicians or their therapists don't ask about. So that really highlights the fact that we need to ask about everything.
Yes. Very much.
Yes, yeah. Um, so then, we have all these things that we need to help our supervisees understand awareness, right? And knowledge and skills and experience too, encouraging them to put themselves in situations where they feel uncomfortable, maybe marginalized and vulnerable and so on. So that's all good because when that happens, I agree with you, the students really learn from their experience and they have a lot of insight, a lot of awareness and so on. But at the same time, sometimes I think they have a really hard time translating their newly gained insight and awareness into action, um, and behavior, right? When it comes to working as psychologists and so on. That's personally a challenge for me when I supervise students. What has your experience been like?
I think that is very true, right? It's like they get this knowledge and then, well, what do I do with that when I'm in the
Mhm.
room? How do I get so nervous about bringing things up, right? And depending on your orientation, is it okay
Yeah.
to bring something into the room? Is it not? Um, I think I think oftentimes, right, I encourage students, like when you're beginning your work, right, to acknowledge the differences
Mhm.
and to just put that out there, right? I noticed there's this difference between us, and as I'm learning different things about you, right, here's something that's different about us. If it feels like it's an issue, I want to
Mhm.
enable you to bring that up,
Yeah.
and point that out. And I think students get very nervous about saying that in the beginning, right? It's kind of like, well, we know we're different races, right? It's like, yeah, we all know that. But if you can say something, right, then you're giving your client permission. Like, it's okay to say something, right? If I feel like you are not getting me. Otherwise, we know clients, kind of like as you said, right? They know what we don't mention. They pay attention to that.
Mhm.
And if you don't say
Mhm.
anything, they may think that's kind of off limits. So it's working with them, I think, like, just put that out there in the beginning, even if there's no issue at that time, to just acknowledge,
Mhm.
right? There's a lot of differences between us. If you want to, that ever becomes an issue, bring it up, and then they're able to, I think once they see, like, okay, your client's not going to run away, they don't
Right.
respond in a negative way, right?
Yeah.
And even if there's nothing then, like later on, as an issue comes up, it's easier to begin to explore that.
Mhm.
um, I think with supervision, I think, that's where you do have the power as the supervisor, right? I mean, I can encourage students to do a lot of things that I think I would find difficult too,
Yeah.
right? But it's reminding them, like, I'm here to support you through this, right? You're going to go and you're going to have this conversation, or you're going to bring up a subject um, in the treatment, right? And then we'll talk about it afterwards, like, how did that go? Are there areas like that you're avoiding that?
Mhm.
Why is that? Because I think, like we use the addressing model at the Chicago school, and
Mhm.
you can see where a student will focus in on, okay, here's an area of difference that I'm comfortable talking about,
Mhm.
right? And you can go, okay, but we've got, I don't know, 8 or 10 or
Yeah.
whatever number of these different areas, right? Is there a reason we may be avoiding some of these other ones? How can we address that if it looks like it might be significant?
Yeah.
Again, it's a little nudging, right? That has to go on. And so, like, this will be okay if you do this, right? Let's see how much, richer or deeper your relationship becomes then, from doing that. Or seeing, I think is really hard as, I mean, probably for all of us, but when we have a rupture,
Yeah.
you go, okay, you had a rupture, there's potential for huge growth now.
Mm.
It doesn't feel like it in the moment, right? But if you can process through that rupture, right, oftentimes the treatment can be much deeper, much richer. It's hard to know that in the moment, right? So that's why I think if you can have a supervisor help
Right.
guide you
Right.
through that.
Yeah.
It's easier when we're on our own, right? And we don't have to answer to anybody. You can take that easy path, but
Mm,
as a supervisor, our job is to try to like, let me help you go down this harder path here
yes.
and
Yeah.
see the potential rewards.
Yeah, that's a good idea to encourage our supervisees to really have difficult dialogues with their clients, even if maybe that might lead to a rupture, but looking at it as an opportunity for growth and development rather than just a rupture that you cannot really remedy or fix.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be especially important for supervisees who are working with people of color where they may have a rupture with their maybe white therapist, and then that's kind of the end of it. It doesn't get
Yeah.
repaired, right? So it's
Yeah.
such an important opportunity to provide that corrective experience.
Yes. Otherwise, everybody's just left feeling damaged, right? And
Exactly.
that's
Yeah,
certainly not what we want to be doing.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good example of what we can do. Um, well, switching gear just a little bit, we always talk about this with our clients, of course, and students. Um, uh, Self-care is obviously really important to prevent burnout and so on, especially during the pandemic where we all of us were really stretched really thin. As a clinician, supervisor, teacher, how do you go about taking good care of yourself? And what do you do to take care of yourself? And what do you recommend when you work with supervisees? Um, and most importantly, how do we overcome some challenges or barriers to taking good care of ourselves? Right, that's hard. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think one of the things that's been most beneficial to me throughout my career is having a consultation group.
Mm.
I have a group of peers that I went to grad school with,
Oh,
right? That we've all stayed in Chicago and
yeah.
stayed connected, and they all do full-time private practice, right? Where I'm just part-time, obviously, but being able to support each other, and because we've known each other for so long,
Mm.
right? I trust them wholly. So, if I have a difficult session, if I have an ongoing issue with my practice, something difficult that's teaching wise, right? Like a hurdle with the
Mhm.
student, I have people I can talk to that I trust, right? And that I know will give me very clear feedback,
Mm.
and honest and direct feedback, or someone who will say, I think you sound like you're burnt out. Like it's probably, I mean, especially through COVID, right? There's been
Wow.
um, just this burst in like everybody wants therapy now, right?
Mhm.
And you know, my friends will joke, it's like if you're not full, like you're not doing something right, because right, everybody's looking. There's so many
Yeah.
referrals around, and like knowing like when to say no,
Mm.
right? Like there's enough. I think that's a huge thing. And it's nice to have someone else say, like, it's okay to say no, and you don't have to take any more. Clients are being very particular about what type of client you're gonna take, like what type
Mhm.
of issue, right? You can't see 25 trauma clients in a week and think you're
Right.
gonna continue to function well, right? Um, and also thinking about just as we experience different things, um, through COVID, through Black Lives Matter, it's all the social injustice and awareness of that, right? I think having people to talk to, whether it's a consultation group, or I mean, there's other times it's, been my own therapist,
Mhm.
is how am I managing this, right? What was hard about, I'm still ongoing about like COVID is we're all experiencing that. I'm experiencing that while I'm talking to people who are profoundly anxious about experiencing it,
Mhm.
watching students go through that, and students being in positions I don't feel like they should be in, um, and trying to support them, but going, okay, I'm experiencing all of this too. One thing I've done and come to peace with, which is, hey, it's hard because, as you know, I live on a farm, right? And so my partner is always doing something physical,
Mhm.
and I have a job where I sit all day. I mean,
Yeah.
like through COVID, right, sitting on a screen for 8 hours, right? I think to most people feels like your job is not so hard. You're just sitting there all day. But it's like I'm taking in all of this
I
pain,
know.
right? I'm trying to process that. So at the end of the day, right, I've given myself permission to, like, if I just want to sit and read a book, or if I want to watch, 3 hours of Netflix, then I'm going to watch 3 hours of Netflix and not feel guilty about it. Because sometimes you just need to watch something that has nothing to do with like the real life that you're um, exposed to all day, right? Just and lost in some fantasy, whether that's a novel or a movie or silly TV show, and to just be okay with that, right? I think I certainly can fall into the I should be meditating, for an hour a day. I should be doing all of these things, right? And you're like, yeah, someday. But it's like, well, what do I need right now, right? Maybe it's, and to just check in at the end of the day. Do I need to go laugh with my kids and, be immersed in them? Do I need some time alone? And that everybody in my household knows, right? Like if I need time alone, like it's okay. It's okay for everybody to say I need my own time and space right now.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is that your needs change, right? Your self-care needs change, and we need to kind of pay attention to that, right? Sometimes you need alone time, sometimes you need to be with people, and sometimes you do meditation, but sometimes not.
Yeah. Sometimes it's, you got to go be active, and other times it's just, I just want to be quiet.
Yeah, exactly. It's just paying attention to ourselves, just like how we pay attention to our clients and our supervisees and students. So what keeps you going in this journey? How do you continue to stay encouraged and hopeful despite setbacks, right? Despite all the barriers that we've been talking about, especially in the most current kind of recent political and social climate. What keeps you going? What keeps you going in your journey?
I think there's so much need, right? It's like you can't ever stop the work because there's so much need. I think it's been really helpful to me, right, to have a lot of students to work with. Because I've certainly had moments in the last several years where I feel like doing individual work can feel like it's a drop in the bucket, right? Like the world is on fire. There's so much need. How do I feel like I'm making a difference, right? And I think being able to do supervision and to teach, being able to share like what I know with a lot of people who are then going to work with a lot more people than I could ever work with on my own. And seeing, young people come in with new ideas, and just how different the youngest generation is. Like the youngest generation of our students, right? How much more they know and how much more awareness that they're starting with, right? I think by the time they get to where I'm at in my career, right, things are going to look vastly different. And just those moments too, where it's, I can say even like in clinical work, like with social justice, the people that I expect like maybe really impacted that's not come into their treatment at all, and other people that I think, I'll give you an example, like of having like a privileged white client and thinking like, is this even on their radar, or is it important? They have all the privileges of life, and seeing like that they're really profoundly impacted, right? And they want to read Kendi's book, right? How to Be an Anti-Racist. Like, okay, this is exciting to me, right? That other people care. Because I always feel like in psychology, we think about these things all the time, right? This is what we do. But to see that that's spreading, that awareness like throughout society, that gives me hope for the future, right? That we're going to continue to get better. And a part of that is being aware of all of the pain around us, right? Which is really hard, but society is becoming very aware of all the pain now, right? That we can do something different. And seeing, students get excited about doing that work.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that really keeps me,
Yes.
that keeps me going.
I agree. Yeah. That's why it's important to teach, supervise, do your own clinical work and so on, right? It's so important to have that balanced view, and that keeps us going to feel
Yeah.
encouraged and
Yeah.
hopeful. Yeah.
And I think because we can do so many different things,
Yes.
you can teach, you can see clients, you can do consultation, you can do assessment. Just knowing, right? Like if one thing feels like too much, I can shift my focus to something else.
Yes.
I think that, that's a wonderful thing about clinical psychology.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
We'll never get bored. Right?
Exactly.
Never get bored.
Yes. Which comes to our last question, which is, I think we agree that as psychologists, we continue to learn and train, and it never really ends. So I was curious as to what further training that would be helpful to you, or that you've been thinking about in the context of culturally responsive supervision or multicultural competence, and so on. What are some things that you have been thinking about in terms of further training?
I think, for myself, anytime I'm going to a conference, right, it's always like, okay, what are the diversity topics here? Is this going to be something new that's going to really fill me up with something new and different that I haven't thought a lot about? Seeing what kind of techniques other people are using, right? It's like, there's so many people out there doing similar kinds of things. What are they bringing into the classroom? What are they bringing into supervision? One thing I always think I wish we had more of were videos, and more timely and more modern videos.
Yeah.
Right. There's one thing, again, talking about it with a class, like just more videos, right? I wish APA would make more videos showing what does this look like in the room? How do you bring the subject up? What do these interventions look like? How are they different and modern thing, right? Oftentimes I feel like I might find something, but if it's from a bygone decade, right, that the students are like, they're very focused on the fashion or the language or the hairstyles instead of the content, because I do think, right, that visual, students really expect visual, right? If I'm trying to have a discussion and I don't have a PowerPoint, right, or you don't have something for them to look at, they feel like they're missing out, right? You need something visual, you need something auditory, you need the experiential. But yeah, I wish we had more training videos so you could see, like, here's the theory, here's what it looks like in practice.
Yeah. And videos with, clients of color or sexual minority clients, right?
Yes.
And so on, people who look and have different lives, who look different and have different lives, would be really wonderful.
And the supervisors, right? Like when I teach supervision, it would be great to have videos of cross-cultural supervision happening in lots of different ways.
Yes. Yeah.
I want our students to be able to see themselves represented there.
Exactly.
Think of themselves as supervisors.
Yes. So important. Yeah. That concludes our podcast interview today. I think obviously the conversation with Dr. Chiles really highlights issues around supervision and culture. And we're really excited to share this with you. Thank you for turning on.